everyone! In this video, I'll be showing you how to make these DIY Potter finger puppet pals. They are really fun to make and I hope you enjoy. Here's what you're going to need. First up, crafting felt. I found packages at Daiso that had all of the colors I would need, but the weight felt a little thin, so I decided to use the individual sheets from the craft store instead. This part is optional, but I decided to make Dumbledore's robes and hat out of a blue velvet fabric instead of the felt. The felt is definitely easier to work with, so keep that in mind if you're deciding which route you want to take. Next, you'll need embroidery floss, embroidery needles, silver sequin stars, hot glue gun, some blue thread and pins if you're going the velvet route, polyester fiber fill, and scissors. First, create the base body patterns. For the base body pattern, I used my index finger as a guideline for height, which ended up being about 2.5 inches tall. Next, I sketched out 2 different head shapes, one for Harry, Ron, Dumbledore, and Voldemort, and a slimmer template for Hermione and Snape. This isn't shown here, but I also drew in semicircles at the sleeves to create a base hand template as well. After this, sketch in the facial features of your puppet friends. Once you're happy with your sketches, trace the template to create individual pattern pieces. For example, each hair piece will need a front and a back. Do this for each character, making sure to keep track of who these pieces are for. If you decide to use velvet for Dumbledore, make sure to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the edges of the hat and robes. To make the robe portion easier to lay flat over his arms, I cut into the body template where the arms would be, and shifted them up and outwards to create a new body base. Then I added the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because his robes are different, I also made his body base differently, adding the hands to the pattern as well. If you're using felt, you can continue using the same template as the other characters. Once the pattern pieces are drawn, we're ready to cut the felt. You'll need to cut 2 pieces of each head and body base, as well as 4 hands for each character. Cut out all hair and facial feature details as well. I used flesh tone for everyone's faces and hands except for Voldemort, black for bodies as well as Harry and Snape's hair, orange for Ron's, brown for Hermione's, red for Voldemort's eyes, and white for Voldemort and Dumbledore's facial features. To finish off the body pieces, simply cut along the corner of the sleeves upwards along a slight curve until about a 1/2 inch from the top. This will create your arms. Next, trace in a guideline for the facial features using a fine point fabric marker. Try to keep these light so they won't show underneath the embroidery thread. By the way, I'm using a cheap tracing tablet from Amazon, but it's definitely not necessary for this tutorial. Once the guidelines are traced, embroider the facial features. I used a flesh tone for Harry's scar, a light pink for Ron's freckles and Hermione's blush, and black for everything else. I used a basic stem stitch for mouths, Dumbledore's glasses, and Snape's eyes, satin stitches for Harry's scar, Hermione's blush, and later decided to do this for Voldemort's eyes as well, French knots for small eye details and freckles, later adding the whites to Hermione's eyes also, and for all of this I used 2 strands of embroidery thread. After embroidering, use 1 strand of thread to attach all of the remaining facial felt pieces, such as the hair fronts, Harry's glasses, Snape's brow and nose, etc. This next step is also optional. I wanted to stuff the heads with polyester fiber fill to add shape, but also not feel the stuffing when used as a functional finger puppet. You can definitely skip this step and continue assembling the rest of the bodies if you wanted to. To fill the heads without having to touch the stuffing, I created new patterns that were slightly smaller than the base head all the way around. This part was a little tricky, but next, sew the backing to the head, lightly catching the felt from the embroidered face piece without pushing the needle all the way through. You want to make sure the backing is secured without having any thread show through your finished face piece. Leave the bottom open and stuff with the fiber fill. Once you have the desired feel, sew up the bottom. When all of the backings have been stuffed and sewn, then sew all of the backs of the heads to the front. If there's hair, sew the backs of the hair to the finished head as well. The bodies are the easiest step. Sew all around the robes, making sure to leave the top, sleeves, and bottom open. Sew the hands together at the curved portion. Don't worry about the flat end, as this will be tucked away inside the sleeves. Attach the hands to the sleeves by inserting them into the sleeves and sewing them shut. Lastly, attach the heads to the torso by only attaching one layer to the other. This is to make sure you can still put your finger through the opening. If you are working with felt, you can continue to assemble Dumbledore's clothing in the same manner as everyone else. But for velvet, it's easier with the sewing machine if you have one. For the hat, sew up the two sides with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim the excess fabric and turn the hat inside out. When placing the hat on his head, it should be a little bit big. Fold up that 1/4 inch seam allowance on the bottom and hand sew the hat to the head. Next up, the cloak. Sew all of the outer seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. These are the two outside sleeves and the two side seams of the body. Turn this inside out and place over Dumbledore's torso piece. Once the velvet is laid flat over the torso, hand sew the two inner seams of the sleeves. Attach the head to the body, folding in the seam allowance of the neckline. Make sure to sew around the head and leave the opening for your finger here too. The last step for this little guy is hot gluing the stars to his cloak and hat. I alternated between larger and smaller stars on both the front and back. And we're finished! Thanks so much for making it to the end of the tutorial. I hope you enjoy your Potter Puppet friends if you decided to try this, and stick around to see them out on a little adventure.